1945. He says he didn't like the sort of society that was being created by the use of these tests, precisely because it promoted people by ability and it revealed very wide differences in people's capacity to do things. And he wanted
that is a painful thing.
Classes.
That is a painful thing. Well, that is a painful thing for anyone psychologically and socially. But the rub is always, compared to what exactly? Oh, well, compared to my hypothetical utopia. It's like, no, your hypothetical utopia is very low resolution and impractical, and if you implemented it, it wouldn't turn out the way you think it would, so we're not going to go there. How about compared to other real things? And you do that in your book, in your recent book, right? You walk through other forms of social organization. You talk about dynastic organizations, you talk about aristocratic organizations that were based, let's say, mostly on the possession of land and that tended to be hereditary. And so they were unbelievably stratified and also completely immobile. And so you can dream up a non-stratified society, but maybe you could comment on this too. I found out late in my life the existence of the Pareto distribution and the Matthew principle. It's quite common among economists. I mean, we tended to think in psychology that everything was normally distributed, but there's lots of things that aren't. When I developed a test called the Creative Achievement Test, which is widely used psychometrically now, and when we first administered it to hundreds of people, and it was basically, it's a test that sums the number of creative achievements you've concretely made in 13 different creative realms. Well, it was wildly Pareto distributed. The median score was 0 across 13 dimensions.
Right.
But there were people who had scores of 80. They were way out on the tails, and we couldn't even utilize the test. It was hard to utilize the test statistically because it didn't conform to the normal distribution assumptions that underlie, IQ testing, for example. That's when I started to become aware of the Pareto distribution. And the Pareto distribution bedevils every society, and so you get stratification. And so these people who are objecting to the meritocracy, okay, well, are they objecting to stratification? And I'd say yes. And so, okay, well, what's the solution to that? Well, then it turns into something like, well, it's capitalism's fault, which is an unbelievably shallow analysis. And that's why I liked your historical approach as well.
What I tried to do in my book was to look at the history of meritocracy and treat it as a historical problem rather than just as a philosophical problem or a legal problem. Because what I wanted to show is that if you look, that meritocracy is a relatively recent thing, and it's an extremely radical thing. And if you look at the history of previous societies, most previous societies have been based on principles other than merit. Because there is an argument that says, of course, we all believe in meritocracy. It's a natural way of doing things. And what's the point of it? What's the point of discussing it? Everybody believes this. In fact, for most of human history, societies have not been organized according to the principle of meritocracy. They've been organized according to the principle of the inheritance of positions from father to son, so dynasties. They've been organized according to the principle of ascription, whereby the position that you have in society is one that you inherit and one that in somehow is regarded as natural. The world is naturally organized into hierarchies. Shakespeare talks about a great deal about how people should reconcile themselves to their position in society, because if they try and change it, it will cause some terrible problem, almost a psychic problem or a problem in the natural order of things. Untune that string, and what discord follows, as you say in Troilus and Cressida. And also, so you have a notion that a static society is a good society, a hierarchical society is a good society, that power and position and property should flow through families and and dynasties that should rule the world. And also you get the question of how in such a society do you allocate positions? Well, there are actually very significant answers to that. One is that you give them away as patronage. Another is that you buy them and sell them. So there was a huge market in jobs in these pre-meritocratic societies that, you would buy a job in the civil service, or you would buy a job as a tax collector. France was a particularly extreme example of this, but most pre-modern societies, had a market in jobs. Jobs were regarded as property. And one of the things that didn't exist in that world was the notion that there is a precise relationship between having a job and your ability to perform that job. So I quote the example in the book of a woman called Margaret Scott, who was the wet nurse to the Prince of Wales. In 1783, she was given a pension of £200 a year. And £200 a year in those days was a great deal of money, but it was also a great deal of money when you consider the fact that the Prince of Wales was 23 years old at the time, and so probably not in need of a wet nurse. But there just isn't a notion that a job is something you do, that you need to be qualified for, that is a set of commitments to your employer.
Okay, so let's take that apart for a minute, because partly what you're pointing to is that the idea of meritocracy is so deeply rooted in our culture that we assume that its existence is something akin to a natural fact.
It's not a natural fact, and it's a fragile fact. It's something that we can lose very easily if we do the wrong things. So that's why I spend so much time talking about history, because what I want to prove in this book is it's something that was created historically and could be destroyed historically. We could move towards a non-meritocratic society, which is what worries me. So
so we assume now, I think, that if I have a job, my job, it doesn't really matter what the job is to produce something productive that other people value in as efficient a manner as possible at a cost that's less than what I'm paid.
Yeah.
Right, yes. Right. And all of those assumptions are questionable. And
absolutely.
Right? I mean they're not natural kinds, which is partly what you're pointing out. Okay, so all right, so we'll accept that. Let's go to the other side of this for a minute. So part of the problem, I think, is terminology, part of what makes people resistant to this, because we also tend to sort of casually talk about elite institutions, which implies a kind of moral valuing. We talk about meritocracy, which implies that the people at the top are of greater merit, right? And that means, to the degree that meritocracy is established on the basis of, let's say, fluid intelligence, that we're conflating moral worth with abstract intellectual ability. And that's really a catastrophe. And that's part of the pride of intellect. And you talked about the best and the brightest. And one of the criticisms that book leveled against the meritocracy was precisely one of intellectual pretension and arrogance, right? It's just because you're smart doesn't mean you're good. It doesn't mean you're wise. It doesn't mean you're meritorious. It doesn't even necessarily mean